The season of sails, the fishermen of Paradis's southern coast called it. That narrow stretch of early autumn when the water calmed enough to risk the outer shoals, when a man could bring in a seasoned salt cod before the storms turned the strait to a graveyard. It was during this season, on a morning when the fog sat so thick over the water that a boat's bow disappeared 8 feet past the prow, that the fishing vessel Marlowe's Luck found the island that was not supposed to be there. Its captain, a broad-shouldered man named Aldrich Faust, who had worked this coastline for 11 years and knew every rock and shoal by memory, would later swear before 3 separate garrison officials that no island existed at that latitude. He had the charts. He had sailed past that exact water 100 times, and yet there it was, low and dark against the gray line of the horizon, wreathed in a mist that did not move the way sea fog moved. It pulsed, faintly, like something breathing. He did not land. He turned the Marlowe's Luck around inside of 10 minutes, sailed back to the harbor at Trost's southern annex with his hands shaking on the wheel, and reported what he had seen to the first uniformed man he found, who happened to be a bored garrison sentry 3 weeks from the end of his post. The sentry did not believe him. The sentry's commanding officer did not believe him either, until 2 more fishing crews came in over the following week, describing the same impossible island, the same wrongness in the mist, and one crew described something else, a sound, low, resonant, like a cello bow drawn once across a string large enough to shake the water itself. That was when the report reached Trost District Command, and from Trost District Command, because anything unexplained and potentially dangerous within 100 miles of the walls was, by standing order, the Survey Corps' business now more than ever. The report reached Commander Hange Zoe. Hange read the report twice at their desk in the reconstructed Survey Corps headquarters, tapping one finger against the paper in a rhythm that meant their mind was already 3 steps ahead of their mouth. 4 years had passed since Wall Maria's reclamation, since Irwin, since the long, brutal work of rebuilding a nation that had spent a century lying to itself. 4 years since Historia had taken the throne and quietly kept the promises that mattered. In that time, Hange had learned to recognize the particular shape of a report that meant something old and dangerous was stirring, and the particular shape of a report that meant something new, something the Survey Corps' hard-won knowledge of Titans, of Marley, of the Founder's power, had no framework for at all. This report had the second shape, an island that isn't on any chart, Hange said aloud, mostly to Levi, who was leaning against the doorframe with the specific posture of a man who had already decided this was going to be a waste of his time. A sound like a cello the size of a mountain. Mist that breathes. Levi, tell me that doesn't sound interesting. It sounds like something that's going to get people killed, Levi said, which is what interesting usually means, with you. Both can be true, Hange said, already pulling maps across the desk. The expedition Hange assembled was small and fast by design. 6 horses, 6 riders, full ODM gear, and enough Thunderspear ordnance to level a small building if the situation demanded it, which Hange privately suspected it might. Levi came because Hange asked, and because someone competent needed to be there to drag people out alive if things went wrong. Jean came because Hange trusted his read on unfamiliar terrain. Connie and Sasha came because they'd both begged, separately, with almost identical arguments about experience and usefulness that Hange found more charming than persuasive, but said yes to anyway. Armin came last, arriving at the stable with a satchel of his own notes on Marley and naval charts and unexplained maritime phenomena, because if there was a mystery within 100 miles of the walls, Armin Arlert intended to be the one working out what it meant before anyone else did. They reached the coast 2 days later and took a requisitioned naval cutter out past the shoals at first light, the same pale, wrong fog rolling toward them across water gone glass still. Sasha stood at the bow with an arrow nocked for no reason she could articulate, except that her hands wanted something to hold. Connie kept glancing at Jean, who kept his jaw set and said nothing, and Armin sat cross-legged near the stern with his notes spread out, murmuring calculations about tide patterns that made no sense for an island that, by every chart in Paradis's naval archive, did not exist. The island rose out of the fog exactly where the fisherman said it would. It was small, perhaps half a mile across, black volcanic rock crowned with wind-bent trees, the kind of forgettable outcrop a chartmaker might simply have missed, except for the thing at its center. A structure, if it could be called that, rose from the island's highest point, easily 80 feet tall, its surface a lattice of pale, faintly luminous strands woven together in overlapping layers, like a spider's web scaled up to impossible size, and then reinforced, thickened, made solid. It did not look like stone. It did not look like Titan hardening, though Hange's mind reached for that comparison immediately, and then discarded it, because hardening was matte and gray and dead-looking, and this thing pulsed with a faint inner light, gold-white, breathing in a slow rhythm that matched, Hange realized with a chill, the low cello string sound the fisherman had reported. The whole cocoon was singing, if singing was even the word, in a frequency so low it lived more in the chest than the ears. "That is not a Titan," Levi said, flat, already scanning the tree line for threats he trusted more than the impossible thing in front of them. "No," Armin said slowly, climbing out of the boat behind him, eyes fixed on the structure. "No, it's not. It's not stone either. Look at the texture. That's fiber. Woven fiber. Like silk, if silk were the size of a building." "Woven by what?" Jean asked, and nobody had an answer, and that silence sat heavier over the group than any Titan roar would have. They approached carefully, weapons drawn but not deployed, boots crunching over black volcanic gravel scattered with a fine, strange dust that caught the weak morning light and glittered faintly gold when it moved. Sasha crouched and touched a pinch of it between two fingers, rubbed it, and found her skin tingling pleasantly where it made contact. Not painful, not corrosive, closer to standing too near a hearth fire. She said as much, and Hange immediately crouched to examine the dust with the fervor of someone who had waited 4 years for a mystery, this genuinely, gloriously new. "Scales," Hange murmured, holding a pinch up to the light. "These are scales, off something with wings, something enormous." The cocoon's surface shifted. It was subtle at first, a ripple across the woven strands, like wind moving through wheat, except there was no wind. Then a section near the base, wide as a barn door, began to split along a seam that had not existed a moment before, the fibers peeling back with a sound like tearing sailcloth crossed with something far more organic, wet, deliberate, alive. "Back," Levi said, and nobody argued. They retreated to the tree line, ODM gear anchors already fired into the trunks behind them, as the seam widened and something vast began to push its way out into the gray morning light. It emerged slowly, a segmented body, pale cream shading into deep jade along ridged sides, easily the size of the largest Titans any of them had ever fought, but built on a logic that owed nothing to Titan anatomy. No exposed muscle, no grotesque humanoid proportions. Instead, a long, deliberate, insect-like form, and small mandibles working at the last clinging fibers of its cocoon, faint bioluminescent striping pulsing along its flanks in that same slow, breathing rhythm the whole structure had carried. It had no eyes that any of them could immediately find, or none that opened yet, and it moved with a strange, unhurried patience that felt, more than anything else, deeply and unmistakably old. "That's a Titan," Connie said, voice cracking slightly. "That has to be some kind of Titan we've never—" "It isn't," Armin said, and something in his voice made everyone look at him instead of the creature. He had gone very still, notes forgotten in his lap, staring at the thing with the particular expression he wore when a piece of a puzzle he hadn't known he was solving suddenly clicked into place. Titans don't cocoon. Titans don't build. This isn't a Titan mutation, and it isn't a shifter. This is a completely different kind of creature, one that's never touched this world before. Then what in the hell is it? Jean said, blades already half drawn, though nothing about the creature's slow, careful movements suggested aggression. Nobody had an answer. The larva, because that was clearly unmistakably what it was. Some vast and impossible juvenile stage of something even larger to come, settled its full length onto the black rock, mandibles finally stilling, and turned what passed for the front of its body toward the 6 humans crouched at the tree line with weapons drawn and hearts hammering. It did not attack. It did not flee. It simply regarded them, in whatever way a creature without visible eyes regarded anything, and the low cello hum resonating from its body shifted pitch, not louder, not threatening, but different, almost curious, the way a person's voice changes when they notice they are being watched. Hange lowered their blades first. It took everything Levi had not to drag them back by the collar. 4 eyes, Levi said, low and dangerous. Whatever's about to come out of your mouth, I want you to think very hard before you say it. I'm going to reach out my hand, Hange said, already moving, eyes bright with the specific, reckless wonder that had gotten them into and out of more disasters than anyone in the Corps could count. Something this deliberate, this patient. It isn't hunting. Look at how careful it's being. I don't think. The larva moved. Not toward Hange, not toward any of them. It turned its head, again, in whatever sense a creature built like this had a head, toward the tree line beyond the ruined cocoon, toward the island's rocky interior, where a low growl had begun to build, guttural and wet, and entirely, horribly familiar. A Titan. Not one of the massive, city-leveling variety. A smaller aberrant, maybe 15 meters, but fast, its 2 long limbs already crashing through the underbrush toward the fresh, unfamiliar scent of human flesh at the shoreline. It must have washed ashore on driftwood weeks ago, feral and starving on an island with nothing to eat, and now, finally, something had arrived worth devouring. Positions, Levi barked, and the Corps scattered into practiced formation, blades igniting off ODM gas canisters, Sasha already loosing an arrow that thudded harmlessly into the Titan's shoulder as it crashed into the clearing, jaw already unhinging, eyes rolling with that mindless hunger. Every one of them had spent years learning to read and to kill. The Titan's charge carried it directly across the clearing, toward Hange, who had frozen half a step too close to the larva, blade only half raised, caught between 2 impossible things at once. The larva moved. It should not have been fast. Nothing that size, that newly emerged, that patient in its stillness, should have been capable of the sudden violent arc of its body as it reared and slammed its full weight sideways into the charging Titan's flank, sending 15 meters of muscle and steaming flesh crashing into the black rock, hard enough that the ground itself shuddered beneath 6 sets of boots. The Titan screamed, a sound none of them had heard from a Titan before, higher and more panicked than the usual mindless roar, and tried to rise, jaw snapping toward the vast pale creature pinning it down. Its teeth closed on the larva's ridged side, and recoiled. Smoke hissed up from the Titan's mouth, its steaming flesh already blistering and sloughing away where it had made contact. Some fine golden dust from the larva's flank clinging to its lips and eating into them like acid finding rot. The Titan thrashed backward, shrieking, clawing at its own ruined mouth, and Levi didn't hesitate. He was already airborne, gas cutting a hard arc through the fog, blades flashing once across the nape before the Titan's body had even finished falling. Steam rose. The Titan's body began its slow collapse into nothing, the way they all did, and the clearing went silent except for that steam hiss and the labored breathing of 6 Survey Corps scouts who had just watched something they could not explain kill a Titan without seeming to notice it had done so. The larva settled back down onto the black rock, mandibles working slowly, the golden dust on its flank already dulling from the reaction, as if nothing of consequence had happened at all. The low cello hum resumed, unbothered, patient, ancient. Hange knelt very slowly in the settling ash and the fine drifting dust, staring at the vast, strange, newly hatched thing that had just, without apparent effort or malice, saved their life. Someone, Hange said quietly, is going to have to write Commander Historia a very interesting letter. Behind them, Armin had already opened his notebook, hand trembling slightly with the effort of trying to sketch something his mind hadn't finished believing yet. Sasha lowered her bow, staring at the corpse steam and the strange, silent creature beside it with equal parts wonder and dread. Connie hadn't moved in almost a full minute. Jean kept his blades drawn, jaw tight, watching the larva the way a soldier watches anything he doesn't yet know how to categorize as friend or threat. Levi landed beside Hange, wiping Titan blood from his blade with the same flat efficiency he brought to everything, and looked down at the creature with open, wary appraisal. "It didn't have to do that," he said. "No," Hange agreed, voice hushed with something that hadn't lived in their chest in a long time. Not since the days before the walls had started giving up their secrets, when the world had still felt, however dangerous, genuinely unknown. It didn't. Far across the water, in a Marleyan naval listening post built to monitor exactly this stretch of coastline for exactly this kind of unexplained disturbance, an operator adjusted his instruments twice, checked the readings a third time to be sure, and then walked the report directly to his superior's office, at a pace just short of running, because whatever had just registered on the seismic and acoustic sensors near Paradis's southern shoals was unlike anything in 11 years of monitoring the island's Titan activity, and someone far above his pay grade was going to need to know immediately that something new, something enormous, and something entirely outside the warrior program's understanding of the world had just been born within striking distance of the walls. That report would take 3 days to reach Liberio. It would take 1 more to reach Theo Magath's desk, and less than an hour after that for Magath to summon Reiner Braun, Porco Galliard, and the newest generation of warrior candidates into a briefing room that had not been used for anything this urgent since before the Jaegerists had first shown their teeth. But that was still 3 days away. For now, on a black volcanic island wreathed in thinning fog, 6 exhausted Survey Corps scouts sat in a loose, wary circle around a vast, cocoon-hatched creature that hummed low and patient in the morning light, and tried to decide what, exactly, they had just found. They did not leave the island that day. Hange made the call within the hour, over Levi's flat, immediate objection. "We came here to scout, Four Eyes, not to move in," and held to it anyway, because whatever this creature was, it had just demonstrated something no Titan, no shifter, no piece of Marleyan or Paradisian weaponry had ever demonstrated in front of Hange's eyes: restraint. It had killed the aberrant only when the aberrant had attacked. It had not so much as flexed toward the 6 humans crouched 20 feet from its flank. That alone was worth the risk of a longer stay, in Hange's judgment, and 4 years of hard-won trust meant that when Hange made that judgment, Levi grumbled and then organized the perimeter instead of arguing further. They set a rough camp on the tree line, close enough to observe, far enough that if the creature's patience proved to have a limit, they'd have half a second's warning. Armin spent the first several hours doing what Armin always did in the face of the unknown, cataloging it, sketching its ridged flanks and the faint bioluminescent striping from 4 different angles, timing the slow rhythm of the cello hum against his own pulse, until he had a rough sense of its cycle. Sasha, after the first hour of tense silence, did something none of them expected. She opened her ration pack, walked to within 10 feet of the creature, ignoring Jean's hissed warning, and set down a strip of dried meat on the black rock, the same instinctive, food-driven diplomacy she'd have offered a wary stray dog. The larva did not eat it. It didn't seem to eat anything at all, as far as any of them could tell over the following hours, though the golden dust along its flanks replenished itself slowly, shimmering faintly brighter each time the low sun broke through the thinning fog, as if it drew its sustenance from light itself rather than flesh. "It's not hunting anything," Armin said, that evening, gathered close around a low fire, with the creature settled 20 yards off, patient and unmoving. "Not us. Not whatever else might wash up on this rock. I don't think it's built to hunt at all. Everything in this world is built to hunt something," Jean said. "That's the whole rule. Titans hunt us. We hunt Titans. Marley hunts anyone who isn't them. You're telling me this thing just doesn't?" "I'm telling you I don't know yet," Armin said. "But I've watched it for 6 hours and it hasn't done anything except exist." "That's not nothing, Jean." "That might be the most important thing we've learned all day." Levi, sharpening a blade he didn't strictly need to sharpen, said nothing for a long moment, watching the creature's slow, ancient stillness across the firelight. "Things that don't hunt still get hunted," he said finally. "Question is who comes looking for it first? Us or Marley?" Nobody had an answer for that either, and the fire burned low, and the creature hummed on, patient as stone, while somewhere far across dark water, a Marleyan listening post's report was already climbing the chain of command toward Liberio. Theo Magath read the seismic transcript twice before he set it down on his desk and looked up at the 2 warrior candidates and 1 veteran Titan holder standing at attention in front of him, and understood immediately that whatever else this briefing accomplished, it was going to change the shape of the coming season. 4 days ago, Magath said, without preamble, because preamble was a luxury Marley's military did not often afford itself anymore. An acoustic and seismic event was recorded off Paradis's southern coastline. The magnitude and frequency profile do not match any known Titan activity. Not founding, not colossal, not any aberrant on record. It does not match naval ordnance, volcanic activity, or weather. Whatever caused it emerged from what our charts list as open water, and what a Paradisian fishing crew has since reported as an island that did not previously exist. Reiner Braun, arms crossed, jaw set in the particular tightness that had become permanent on his face somewhere around the fall of Wall Maria, and never fully left, spoke first. "You're saying something new showed up, something that isn't us, isn't them, isn't Titans." "I'm saying I don't know what it is," Magath said, which is precisely the problem. Marley's entire military doctrine for the last century has been built on 2 categories of threat: the 9 Titans, and everyone who wants to take them from us. We have contingencies for both. We have none for a 3rd category we cannot name. Porco Galliard, leaning against the wall with the loose, unbothered posture he wore like armor, tilted his head. "So what? We send a scouting force? See what it is before Paradis decides it's theirs to weaponize?" "That's exactly what we do," Magath said. Quietly, "I am not putting this in front of the War Council until I know whether we're looking at a natural phenomenon, a Paradisian fabrication, or something considerably worse than either. Reiner, Porco, you'll lead a small naval reconnaissance element. Discretion first. If it is hostile, or if it is something the Survey Corps intends to weaponize against Marley, I need to know before it becomes the next rumbling-scale catastrophe this world can't afford." He paused, then added, in the flat, worn tone of a man who had spent a decade watching every certainty he'd built his life on get taken apart piece by piece, "And bring 2 of the candidates. Debby and Falco. If this is going to define the next chapter of this war, the next generation needs to see it with their own eyes, not read about it in a briefing years from now the way we did with everything that actually mattered. Debby Braun, seated at the end of the table, straightened at the sound of her name with the sharp, hungry attention that had never once needed to be asked for twice. By the fourth day, the larva had not moved from the black volcanic outcrop, and Hange had grown convinced, over the still simmering objections of Levi, who trusted nothing this patient, that whatever this creature was waiting for, it was waiting for something specific, not simply resting. The Chelohum had changed twice more since their arrival. Once, subtly, in response to a passing storm that broke against the coastline and left the larva's bioluminescent striping pulsing brighter, faster, as if the creature drew some manner of strength from the charge in the air. And again, more strikingly, in the hour before dawn on the fourth morning, when the hum deepened into something with an almost architectural quality, long, resonant, layered, like multiple frequencies stacking on top of one another. "It's building again," Armin said, watching the faint threads of pale silk beginning to extrude from small apertures along the creature's flanks, weaving themselves in slow, deliberate arcs across the black rock. A second cocoon, bigger than the first. "How is that possible?" Connie said. "It just hatched out of one. I don't think this is what it's going to look like when it's done," Armin said slowly, watching the strands weave and thicken, sketching furiously to keep pace. "I think what we saw hatch 4 days ago was a first stage. I think this, whatever's about to happen here, is the real one." Hange crouched close, with the specific reckless delight of someone watching a mystery unfold exactly the way they'd hoped it would, allowed themselves a slow, wondering breath. "Levi, however much time you think we have before something with real teeth comes looking for this island, I think we're about to run out of it a lot faster than expected." Levi's eyes moved from the half-woven cocoon to the empty gray horizon, and something in his flat expression sharpened into the specific alertness of a soldier who had learned, over and over, that the worst arrivals were always the ones nobody saw coming until it was too late to prepare. "Then we watch," he said, "and we get every scout we can spare out here before whoever else noticed that seismic event decides to come see it for themselves." The Marleyan vessel reached visual range of the island on the 6th day, low in the water, running dark, its approach timed for the pre-dawn fog that still clung stubbornly to this stretch of coastline, even a week after the larva's arrival. Reiner stood at the bow beside Porco, both in plain naval fatigues rather than warrior uniform. Debby and Falco crouched below the gunwale per Magath's explicit orders. "Observe. Do not engage. Do not reveal Titan capability unless survival demanded it." What Reiner saw through the thinning mist stopped every calculation he'd made on the crossing dead in its tracks. The black outcrop was no longer the modest, forgettable rock the naval charts described. A second structure now dominated its highest point, vast, layered, woven from pale strands thick as ship's rigging, glowing faintly gold-white from some internal source, easily twice the size of whatever had produced the seismic reading a week prior. And arranged in a loose defensive perimeter around its base, Reiner counted 6 figures in Survey Corps green, ODM gear catching the weak dawn light. "They got here first," Porco murmured, low enough that only Reiner and the 2 candidates crouched below him could hear. "Of course they did. It's practically in their front yard. That doesn't mean they understand it any better than we do," Reiner said, eyes fixed on the massive cocoon, on the way its faint light pulsed in a slow, deliberate rhythm that felt, even from this distance, disturbingly alive. "Magath wanted eyes on this before we decide anything. So we watch." Debby, crouched low but unable to fully contain herself, risked a glance over the gunwale at the structure and went very still. "Reiner," she said, quiet and urgent, "that's not a Titan. I don't care what the report said. That's not anything like a Titan. No, Reiner agreed, jaw tight, already running through every scenario in which this discovery ended badly for Marley, for Paradis, or for the fragile, exhausted peace both sides had barely begun building since the fall of the old order. It isn't. The cocoon split at dawn. It did not tear the way the first one had. Violent, sudden, insect shedding its skin. This second emergence was slower, more deliberate, the woven strands unfurling outward in overlapping petals like a flower opening to greet the sun, releasing a fine cascade of golden dust that caught the first true sunlight of the morning and turned the entire clearing incandescent, as if dawn itself had arrived a second time, more intensely, focused entirely on this single patch of black volcanic rock. What emerged from within was no longer the pale, segmented larva that had killed an aberrant titan without apparent effort 6 days before. She was vast, wings unfurling in slow, deliberate stages, each fold releasing more of that shimmering dust, patterned in deep crimson and gold and black eye-like markings that seemed, in the low morning light, to shift and deepen the longer any of the watchers stared at them. Her body, slender now, segmented, trailing delicate antennae plumage, lifted from the wreckage of her second cocoon with a grace that defied every law of scale Hange's mind had ever applied to anything this size. Compound eyes, faceted and faintly violet, opened for the first time and swept slowly, deliberately, across the clearing, across 6 Survey Corps scouts frozen at the tree line, across a Marleyan naval vessel half hidden in the retreating fog, across the whole ruined, war-scarred, precariously balanced world she had just been born into. She did not roar. She did not charge. She simply lifted, wings catching the dawn wind with a sound like 1,000 silk banners unfurling at once, and rose slowly into the brightening sky above the island, ancient, patient, radiant, and utterly, unmistakably aware of every single person watching her. On the shoreline, Hange stood with both hands pressed to their mouth, tears they would later swear were simply the wind streaming freely down their face, watching something that felt less like witnessing a new kind of monster and more like witnessing the birth of a myth. Aboard the Marleyan vessel, Reiner Braun watched the goddess rise into the dawn sky above a world already drowning in titans and war and impossible choices, and felt, for the first time in longer than he could remember, something that was not dread. It was closer to awe. And somewhere in the vast, wheeling silence above the island, Mothra turned her ancient gaze toward the distant gray line of the walls on the horizon, toward the caged, desperate, dying world she had just entered, and began, slowly, to decide what she had come here to protect, and what she had come here to end. She did not fly toward the walls immediately. For 3 days, Mothra circled the waters surrounding the island in slow, deliberate arcs, wings catching the light in a way that turned the sea beneath her into a shifting field of gold and crimson reflection. And the Survey Corps scouts who remained to observe her found themselves working out, gradually, painfully, that she was not simply resting or exploring. She was watching. Every fishing vessel that passed within a mile of her flight path, she studied with those faceted violet eyes before moving on. Every stretch of coastline she traced, she seemed to measure against some internal reckoning none of them could guess at. "She's mapping the damage," Armin said, on the second evening, watching her distant silhouette bank slowly along the horizon, where the ruined remains of an old coastal watchtower, one of dozens abandoned since the wall's reclamation, still jutted from the water like a broken tooth. "Look at where she keeps circling back, the old battle sites, the wreckage. She's not looking at us. She's looking at what happened here before she arrived." "That's a hell of a leap from watching a moth fly around," Jean said, though there was less certainty in his voice than the words carried. "She's not a moth," Hange said quietly, still cataloging every observation in a notebook now 3/4 full. Whatever she is, Moth doesn't begin to cover it. Levi, arms crossed, eyes tracking her distant flight with the wary patience of a soldier who had learned to respect anything that hadn't yet shown him its true shape, said nothing for a long moment. Then, she hasn't come near us since she hatched, hasn't threatened the Marleyan boat sitting a mile off our flank either, and don't think I haven't noticed it's still there. Whatever she's deciding, she's taking her time about it. He was right, and everyone at the tree line knew it. And across the water, the small Marleyan reconnaissance vessel held its position with the same wary patience. Reiner and Porco watching the goddess's slow circling flight, with expressions that had shifted, over 3 days, from calculated threat assessment into something closer to reluctant reverence, while Gabi crouched at the gunwale with a look on her face that Falco had never seen her wear before. Not ambition, not hunger for glory, but something quieter and more unsettled. She keeps looking at the wreckage, Gabi said, low, mostly to Falco. Every burned-out watchtower, every wrecked hull, like she's counting something. Counting what? Falco asked. I don't know, Gabi admitted, and the admission cost her something, because Gabi Braun did not often admit to not knowing things. But I don't think we're the ones she's deciding about. I think it's this whole ocean, this whole war. On the 4th morning after her emergence, Mothra changed course. She banked hard over the island one final time, wings tilting to catch the dawn wind, and began climbing, not toward the horizon where the walls waited, not toward either watching vessel, but straight up, higher and higher until her vast wingspan was a distant shape against pale cloud, gathering height the way a hawk gathers height before a long, purposeful glide. She's leaving, Sasha said, bow already forgotten at her side, watching with an expression caught somewhere between relief and loss. Or she's about to arrive somewhere, Armin said, tracking the angle of her climb, the direction her body had oriented toward before the ascent began. He went very still. Hange, that heading, that's not open water. That's a straight line toward the coast, toward Wall Maria. Hange's expression shifted instantly from wonder to urgency. How long do we have before she reaches the wall? At that altitude, that wingspan? I don't know. Faster than any horse could warn them. Faster than any signal flare could travel, probably. Then we ride, Levi said, already moving toward the horses tied at the tree line. And we pray somebody at Wall Maria doesn't do something stupid the second they see a Titan-sized moth clear the horizon. Aboard the Marleyan vessel, Reiner had reached the same grim calculation half a beat behind them, watching Mothra's distant silhouette climb and turn, with an intent that could no longer be mistaken for aimless wandering. She's heading for the walls, he said, low, to Porco. We need to signal Magath, now, before whatever happens next happens without us knowing a damn thing about it. The scouts atop Wall Maria's southern watchpost that morning were young, barely 2 years out of training, part of the newer generation who had grown up in the uneasy, half-rebuilt peace since the wall's reclamation, who had heard the old stories of Titans breaching the gate, but had never personally watched it happen. They were not prepared, in any sense, for what came out of the southeastern sky an hour past dawn. The alarm horn sounded first, a single low blast, then a second, then a ragged chaos of them, as more sentries along the wall's length caught sight of the shape now visible even to the naked eye, wings spanning wider than anything any of them had ever imagined a living creature could possess, gliding on an unhurried, deliberate approach toward the wall itself. Titan shifter, someone shouted, though nothing about the shape matched any shifter silhouette in any training manual any of them had studied. All positions, signal garrison command, we need. That's not a Titan, another voice cut in, young and shaking. Look at it. That's not, sir. What is that? Garrison command reached the wall's crest within 12 minutes, faster than any drill had ever required, and found 40 sentries with weapons half raised and utterly unprepared for a target none of their protocols accounted for. Watching a vast, winged, radiant creature bank slowly along the wall's length, at a distance that kept her, deliberately or not, just outside effective ODM engagement range. She did not attack. She did not breach. She simply traced the wall's massive gray curve from a slow, careful distance, wing beats stirring updrafts that rattled loose stone and sent dust sheeting off the ancient masonry in golden clouds, and the sentries atop that wall watched something ancient and impossibly vast study the last great fortress of a dying old order, with an expression, if a creature built like this could be said to have expressions, that looked less like a predator sizing up prey, and more like a physician examining a wound. By the time Hange's scouting party arrived at a full gallop 3 hours later, lathered horses near collapse, the garrison had organized a full defensive posture along the wall's crest, and had not fired a single thunder spear, held back by the flat, urgent order relayed from Historia's own council. Do not engage until we understand what we are looking at. Hange arrived breathless, boots hitting the ground before the horse had fully stopped, and found Levi already scanning the sky with the same wary intensity he'd carried since the island. She hasn't attacked, a garrison captain reported, voice tight with 3 hours of barely restrained panic. She's just circling, looking. We don't know what she wants. Neither do we, Hange admitted, and for the first time since the whole impossible affair began, allowed the weight of that uncertainty to show plainly on their face. But I don't think we're going to get an answer standing here waiting for her to decide it for us. High above, Mothra completed one final slow pass along Wall Maria's length, ancient violet eyes taking in the scarred, rebuilt stone, the fresh mortar patched over gaps torn open by titans years before, the small desperate figures arrayed along its crest with weapons raised and hearts hammering. And then, without warning, without any signal any of them could read, she turned away from the wall entirely and began climbing again, banking east, toward the deep interior of Paradis itself, toward Wall Rose, toward the heart of the world she had come to judge. She's not done, Armin said, watching her shrinking silhouette with a chill that had nothing to do with the cold morning wind. Whatever she's looking for, it isn't here. That evening, in Liberio, Theo Magath read the naval signal Reiner had transmitted at first light. Unidentified entity, confirmed non-hostile in initial contact, approaching Paradisian interior wall structures, scale and capability unprecedented, recommend full War Council briefing, and set the paper down on his desk with the particular stillness of a man recalculating every strategic assumption he had built his career on. Get me the warrior program's full roster status, he said, to the aide waiting at attention by the door. And get me everything Grice, Braun, and Galliard observed, in writing, before the details soften with time. Whatever is walking, flying, through Paradis right now, it did not come from any war either side has ever fought. And I intend for Marley to understand it before Paradis decides to make it theirs. Outside his window, the gray Liberio evening settled over row upon row of internment zone housing, and somewhere far across the sea, a goddess climbed higher into darkening sky, carrying inside her ancient, patient mind a question that would, before this was over, force every faction in this fractured world to answer for what they had built. Wall Rose's interior held a different texture of fear than Wall Maria's crest had, where the garrison sentries atop the outer wall had faced Mothra with the specific, hardened dread of soldiers who expected monsters and simply hadn't expected this particular one. The townspeople of the interior districts had spent a generation believing the worst of the old horrors were finally behind them. When the alarm bells began ringing across Rose's farmland districts that afternoon, it was not soldiers who first poured into the streets to look up, but shopkeepers, farmers, children pulled from schoolyards by teachers who did not yet understand what they were fleeing. Mothra passed over the district of Yarkel first, low enough that her shadow swallowed the entire town square in a slow-moving eclipse, wing beats stirring dust and loose thatch from rooftops, and the sound she carried, that low, resonant cello-deep hum, rattled window glass in every house beneath her flight path. She did not descend, she did not slow, but she circled the town twice, unhurried. That same clinical, searching quality in her flight that Armin had first noted over the ruined coastal watchtowers, and then moved on, toward the district's edge, toward the old fields where 4 years ago a mass grave had been dug for the dead of Wall Maria's fall, the ones who never made it past the gate. She hovered there, wings beating slow enough to hold her vast weight aloft with something like stillness, gazing down at the modest stone markers and the wildflowers someone had planted between them, for nearly 10 full minutes, while the townspeople of Yarkil clustered at a fearful distance and watched a goddess mourn ground she had never once set foot on before that day. "She knows," said an old woman near the front of the crowd, a woman named Ilsa who had lost 2 sons in the fall and had not cried about it in front of another living soul in 4 years, and did so now, openly, without embarrassment, watching the vast winged shape hold vigil above her boy's unmarked patch of earth. Whatever she is, she knows what happened here. By the time Hange's exhausted party reached Yarkil that evening, Mothra had already moved on, banking further east and inward, and the story that met them at the town's edge was not one of panic, but of something stranger and harder to categorize. Dozens of witnesses, farmers and soldiers and children alike, all describing the same thing, a monster the size of a mountain who had looked at their dead and grieved. "She's not scouting anymore," Hange said quietly to Levi, reading through 6 different eyewitness accounts that all converged, improbably, on the same emotional core. "Or if she is, it's not the kind of scouting we do. She's not counting our defenses, she's counting our losses." Levi's jaw was tight. "That's worse," he said. "Something that grieves for you can still decide you're not worth saving." 3 districts over, in a modest farming settlement that had not seen this much military attention since before the fall, a very different kind of witness watched Mothra's distant, circling silhouette from behind a hedge line, with far more calculation than grief. Yelena, former Marleyan intelligence operative, longtime architect of the Jaegerist movement's ideological backbone, still moving through Paradisian territory under 3 separate false identities in the uneasy years since Zeke's death and the rumblings' aftermath, watched the goddess's slow, searching flight with the particular hunger of someone who had spent her entire adult life looking for something worth worshipping, and had never quite managed to find it in mortal men. She had heard the reports 2 days prior, filtered through the remaining threads of the old Jaegerist network she still quietly maintained, more out of habit and loyalty to a dead man's memory than any coherent plan. A creature of impossible scale, hatched from the sea, grieving over graves it had no connection to. Something in that image had lodged itself in Yelena's chest and refused to let go. "You've been staring at that thing for an hour," said the man beside her, a former restorationist sympathizer named Flock Forster, spared execution after the rumblings' collapse only by the specific, grudging mercy of a new Paradisian government trying to build something other than another cycle of purges, and now living a quiet, watchful half-life among the scattered remnants of a movement with no leader left to follow. "Zeke wanted a world without cruelty," Yelena said, not looking away from the sky. "He thought the only mercy left for our people was extinction. I never believed that. I think he was wrong about the ending, even if he was right about everything that came before it." She finally turned to look at Flock, her expression unreadable in the fading light. "What if that isn't a monster up there, Flock? What if it's an answer? An answer to what?" "To the only question that ever mattered," Yelena said. "Whether something can love this world enough to fix it, instead of simply ending it." Flock said nothing, watching the distant, radiant shape bank slowly over the fields, and felt, Despite every hardened cynicism 4 years of collapse and disillusionment had carved into him, a small and unwelcome seed of something he hadn't allowed himself to feel in a long time. Hope, maybe, or its far more dangerous cousin, devotion, waiting for something to attach itself to. The War Council convened in Mitras that night carried none of the calm deliberation Historia Reese had hoped to bring to her reign. Commander Hange's field report had arrived by fast rider only 2 hours before the council gathered, and its contents, non-hostile, grieving behavior observed at mass grave sites, scale exceeding any known Titan, capabilities unknown, had done nothing to settle the room's nerves. "We cannot simply wait and see," argued General Pixis's successor, a cautious, by-the-book officer named Nile Doc, still holding his old military police rank out of habit, though the institution he'd once commanded had been restructured twice since the fall. A creature of that scale, moving freely through our interior districts. If it decides tomorrow that grieving isn't enough, that action is required, we will have no defense prepared. And if we attack something that's done nothing but mourn our dead, Hange shot back, exhaustion fraying the edges of their usual manic energy, we will have manufactured an enemy out of the one being in this entire world who's shown us anything resembling compassion since this war began. I watched it kill a Titan to protect us without being asked. I watched it grieve over a mass grave it had no reason to care about. I am not going to be the one who turns that into a threat just because we don't understand it yet. Historia, seated at the head of the table with the quiet, worn authority of a queen who had spent 4 years learning that peace was harder to hold than war had ever been to fight, raised a hand before the argument could escalate further. "Commander Hange is right that we don't attack first," she said. "But General Doc is right, that we cannot simply do nothing. Armin." She turned to him. The boy. No, the young man now, changed by everything he'd survived, who had sat quietly through the entire debate with the particular stillness of someone already 3 steps ahead in his thinking. "You've studied this creature more closely than anyone in this room. What does she want?" Armin was quiet for a moment, choosing his words with the same careful precision he'd once used to talk his way out of certain death in front of a colossal Titan's steam. "I don't think she wants anything from us yet," he said finally. "I think she's still deciding whether we're worth wanting anything from at all. Every district she's passed over, she's looked at our worst scars, our graves, our ruins, the places this war has cost us the most. I think she's not scouting our defenses. I think she's asking herself a single question, over and over. Is this a world worth protecting, or a world that's already too broken to save?" The council fell silent at that, the weight of it settling over the room like the shadow of vast wings. "And if she decides we're not worth it?" Nile Doc asked, quieter now. "Then I imagine," Armin said, "we find out exactly how much worse this war can get." Far to the east, past Wall Rose's interior farmland, past the last remaining scars of the old sheltered century, Mothra had reached the edge of Wall Sina and slowed her endless circling flight for the first time since her emergence, hovering above the glittering, untouched wealth of the innermost city, the manors, the cathedral spires, the opulence that 4 years of post-war reconstruction had rebuilt faster and more completely here than anywhere else in the ruined nation, because money and privilege had always recovered first. She held there, wings beating slow and steady, violet eyes sweeping across marble courtyards and gilded rooftops with an expression that, for the first time since her arrival, looked less like grief and more like something colder, something closer to judgment. She hung above Wall Sina for the better part of an hour, and word of it spread through the innermost city faster than any garrison alarm could travel, not through official channels, but through the older, faster network of servants gossiping in kitchen doorways, and merchants abandoning their stalls to stare skyward, until half the district had turned its face upward, to watch a goddess study their gold-leafed rooftops in silence. It was Nile Doc's messenger who found Hange's party first, intercepting them on the road just past Rose's inner gate, with orders sealed by Historia's own hand. Proceed to Sina immediately. Full authority to engage or negotiate as circumstances require. Avoid provocation at all costs. Hange read the order twice, handed it to Levi without comment, and spurred their horse harder. They reached the district's outer wall as the light was failing, gold going gray-violet across a sky still dominated by that vast, patient, circling shape, and found the scene waiting for them stranger than anything the road reports had prepared them for. A crowd had gathered at the base of the old Reese family cathedral, not fleeing, not screaming, but standing in a loose, murmuring half-circle, faces turned upward, and at the crowd's front edge, close enough that Hange's stomach dropped at the sheer recklessness of it, stood a cluster of figures in mismatched civilian dress that Hange recognized with a jolt of old, complicated history. Flock Forster, and beside him, unmistakably, despite the years and the false names and the quiet disappearance from every watch list Paradis's restructured intelligence apparatus maintained, Yelena. "You have got to be joking," Levi muttered, already dismounting, hand drifting to his blade hilt out of pure reflex. "Belay that," Hange said quickly, catching his wrist before the gesture could escalate into something the crowd would read as an attack. "Whatever she's doing here, whatever they're doing here, the last thing this district needs is humanity's strongest, starting a fight in front of a few hundred witnesses, and a creature that could level the whole quarter with one bad wing beat." They approached carefully, and Yelena turned to meet them before either could speak, her expression calm, almost serene, in a way that unsettled Hange more than open hostility would have. "Commander Hange," Yelena said, "I wondered how long it would take Paradis to send someone competent." "Yelena," Hange said, flat, "you were supposed to be a ghost. Multiple ghosts. If the reports on your identities were accurate, ghosts get to watch," Yelena said, "and I've watched enough of this world's cruelty to last several lifetimes. I came to see something different, for once." She tilted her head up toward the vast, circling shape above them, violet eyes and crimson wings catching the last of the dying light. "I think you should ask yourself why she stopped here, Commander. Of everywhere she's flown since she hatched, the walls, the graves, the farmland, she's held her position here longer than anywhere else. Above the one district in this entire ruined country that never went hungry, never buried its children in mass graves, never once had to choose between loyalty and survival." Hange followed her gaze upward, and something cold settled into their chest that had nothing to do with the evening air. "You think she's judging Sina specifically?" "I think," Yelena said, "she came from the sea and found a mass grave in Rose within her first hour on land, and grieved over it like it was her own kin. And I think she spent the last hour circling the one district built entirely on the bones of everyone else's suffering, without a single grave in sight to grieve over." "Draw your own conclusions, Commander. I've drawn mine." Flock, quieter, more subdued than Hange remembered him from the War Council testimonies 4 years prior, spoke up beside her. "Zeke thought this whole world needed to end so it would stop hurting people. I used to believe that too, back when I still believed in anything. But I look at that up there, and I don't think she came to end anything." He shook his head slowly. "I think she came to see if it's worth fixing, and I don't know what happens to a district like this one if she decides it isn't." Above them, Mothra's slow circling finally ceased. She hovered, wing beats stilling into something closer to suspension, hanging motionless above the cathedral's gilded spire for one long, breathless moment that seemed to still the entire crowd's collective breath along with her. And then, deliberately, unmistakably, she turned her vast head downward and looked directly at the assembled onlookers below, violet compound eyes catching what little light remained. Nobody moved. Nobody spoke. Levi's hand had found his blade hilt again, and this time Hange didn't stop him, because whatever was about to happen next, they had the sudden, certain feeling that swords would matter less than anything anyone in that crowd chose to do in the next 10 seconds. A child broke from the crowd's edge. She could not have been older than 6, dressed in the kind of fine embroidered clothing that marked her as inner district gentry, and she had slipped free of whatever hand had been holding hers before anyone could catch her, running out into the open cathedral square with the fearless, uncomplicated curiosity only a child that age could still afford in a world this broken. She stopped perhaps 30 feet out, craned her neck all the way back, and lifted both small arms toward the impossible hovering shape above her. "Are you sad?" the child called up, voice thin and clear in the enormous silence. "You look sad." A collective gasp went through the crowd. Somewhere behind Hange, a woman, presumably the child's mother, made a strangled sound and started forward, and Levi's arm shot out to stop her, not unkindly, but with the flat certainty of a man who understood, suddenly and completely, that interrupting this moment might be the single most dangerous thing anyone could do. Mothra held perfectly still for 3 full seconds. Then, slowly, with a care that defied every law of scale her vast body should have obeyed, she lowered herself, not landing, never landing, wing beats still working to hold her titanic weight aloft, until her enormous head hung barely 20 feet above the small girl's upturned face, close enough that the golden dust drifting from her wings settled like warm snowfall across the cathedral square, close enough that the low cello hum resonating from her body could be felt in the child's small chest as much as heard. And the girl, entirely unafraid, entirely unbothered by the impossible scale of the thing hovering above her, smiled. Mothra's hum shifted, deepened, then rose, then settled into something that no one gathered in that square could have named with certainty, but that every single one of them, without exception, felt land in their own chest, like the first breath after holding one for far too long. Something that felt, unmistakably, like relief. She rose again, slowly, gently, wing beats stirring the child's hair and dress in a soft golden-dusted wind, and climbed back into the darkening sky above Wall Sina. And this time, when she turned away from the cathedral district, she did not resume her slow, searching, judgmental circling. She flew west, toward the setting sun, toward the open coastline beyond Wall Maria, toward the ruined, unglamorous, hard-suffering districts that made up the vast majority of this broken country. And something in the sureness of her flight path told everyone watching that whatever question she had come here carrying, she had, in that cathedral square, finally found the beginning of an answer. Hange let out a breath they hadn't realized they'd been holding and looked over at Yelena, who was watching the retreating shape with an expression of quiet, devastating hope that Hange found more unsettling than anything else that had happened all evening. "You wanted her to judge Sina and find it wanting," Hange said slowly. "You wanted a reckoning." "I wanted the truth," Yelena said. "Whatever that turned out to be." She finally looked away from the sky, meeting Hange's eyes with something almost like challenge. "It seems the truth is more complicated than either of us expected. A goddess who grieves for the suffering and still finds mercy for the privileged. Because even the privileged send out children who haven't yet learned to be cruel." She allowed herself something close to a smile, thin and worn, but genuine. "That's a more interesting god than the one Zeke Yeager wanted to build a philosophy around. I think I'd like to know her better." "That," Levi said flatly, sheathing his blade at last, "is exactly the kind of sentence that gets people killed in this world, Yelena." "Perhaps," Yelena said, "but I've been dead in every way that matters since the day Zeke chose the rumbling over me. Following a god who chooses mercy over judgment seems like a considerably better way to spend whatever's left." 300 miles east, in a Marleyan naval command post now fully briefed on everything the Reiner-led reconnaissance team had witnessed since the island's discovery. Theo Magath studied the fast-relayed reports of Mothra's flight over Sina, the mass grave vigil in Rose, the district-wide scrutiny of Paradis's wealthiest quarter, the astonishing final moment with the child, and felt the last of his certainty about how to categorize this creature crumble entirely. "She's not a weapon," he said quietly, to Reiner and Porco, both freshly returned and still visibly unsettled by everything they'd witnessed firsthand. "She's not a beast either. Whatever the initial reports suggested, she's making judgments, moral judgments, about an entire civilization, in real time, based on what she finds when she looks at it." "That's worse than a weapon," Porco said. "A weapon does what you point it at. This thing decides for itself." "Which means," Magath said, setting the report down with the particular grimness of a man arriving at an unwelcome conclusion, "that Marley cannot afford to be the next civilization she looks at and finds wanting. Not with what she's already capable of, and not with what we don't yet know she's capable of beyond it." He looked up at Reiner. "Prepare a full briefing for the War Council. I want every warrior candidate, every Titan holder we have, ready for the possibility that we are not choosing whether to engage this creature. We are choosing how she engages us, once she inevitably turns her judgment toward Marley itself." Reiner's jaw tightened, old weight settling back onto shoulders that had never fully set it down since the day he'd first walked into Shiganshina wearing another boy's stolen name. "And Gabi, Falco, the rest of the new candidates? They watched a god decide mercy over judgment today, because one child wasn't afraid of her," Magath said. "I suggest you make sure every one of them remembers that lesson, Reiner, because I have a feeling Marley is going to need every ounce of grace this creature is capable of offering, before whatever comes next is finished." Outside the command post's narrow window, the sun finished setting over water gone the color of old blood, and far across that darkening sea, a goddess flew on toward the ruined western coastline, carrying inside her ancient mind the first fragile threads of hope for a world she had not yet decided was worth saving, and the first fragile threads, too, of exactly how much that hope was going to cost her before the reckoning she carried was finished. The western coastline Mothra flew toward that night was not, in truth, a single place. It was a scattered constellation of the poorest, hardest-hit fishing settlements along Paradis's outer edge. Communities that had spent the century behind the walls at the very bottom of every ration list, every rebuilding priority, every measure of the old sheltered order's cruelty. Since the fall, they had fared little better. The new government's resources went first to the interior districts, to Sina's reconstruction, to the military's endless hunger for funding, and the fishing towns along the coast had been left to rebuild themselves largely alone, brick by salvaged brick. It was to one of these towns, a modest, storm-battered settlement called Kelstadt, population perhaps 400, still recovering from a bad harvest and a worse fishing season, that Mothra descended at last, 3 hours past nightfall, wing beats slowing to something almost gentle as she settled, for the first time since her emergence, into an actual landing. She did not land in the town itself. She came down on the tidal flats just beyond it, wings folding slowly against her sides, the golden dust that drifted from her settling across wet sand in a fine glowing scatter that lit the whole shoreline in soft amber light, visible for miles along the dark coast. The people of Kelstadt did not flee. Word of her mercy at Sina's cathedral had already reached them, carried by fast riders and faster rumor, the story of the fearless child and the goddess who had lowered herself in gentle answer, already taking on the specific, embellished shape of instant local legend. And so when the vast, radiant shape settled onto their tidal flats in the dead of night, the response was not panic, but something closer to a slow, disbelieving pilgrimage. Lanterns were lit, doors opened, an entire fishing town, exhausted and hungry and hard used by a century of being forgotten, walked out into the cold night air to see, with their own eyes, whether the stories were true. Hange's party arrived at dawn to find the tidal flats transformed into something between a vigil and a festival. Townspeople gathered in loose clusters around the resting, wing-folded goddess, close enough to touch, though none dared. Children asleep in parents' arms after a night spent watching in wonder rather than fear, and Mothra herself, still and patient, violet eyes tracking the small human movements around her with what had become, unmistakably now, an expression of something like tenderness. "She came here on purpose," Armin said, taking in the scene with the same careful, cataloging attention he'd brought to every stage of this unfolding mystery. "Not Sina, not Mitris, here, the poorest coastline in the entire country." "Where else would a god of mercy go?" said an old fisherman standing near Hange, his voice rough with a night of no sleep and too much wonder. "Except to the people nobody else remembers." Levi, surveying the scene with his usual flat wariness, found himself, for once, without a cutting response ready. He simply watched the vast, patient shape resting on the tidal flats, dust still drifting gently from her folded wings, and felt something shift in his own long-hardened assessment of what this creature actually was. It was Hange who approached first, slowly, deliberately, hands empty and visible, the same careful posture they'd have used approaching any wounded, uncertain animal, though nothing about Mothra suggested fear or aggression. They stopped perhaps 15 feet from her folded wing, close enough now that the low cello hum vibrated audibly in their own chest. "We don't know what to call you," Hange said quietly, more to themselves than any real expectation of being understood. "We don't have a word for what you are, but I think we're starting to understand what you're looking for." Mothra's great head turned, slow and deliberate, violet compound eyes, settling fully on Hange, for the first time since the encounter on the island 6 days prior. And though nothing about her physiology should have permitted anything resembling human expression, Hange would swear for the rest of their life that in that moment, something in the ancient creature's gaze conveyed unmistakable, patient recognition, the specific weight of being truly seen, and in turn, seeing clearly in return. The moment held for a long, breathless span. The whole exhausted, hopeful town gathered silent around them, golden dust still settling soft across wet sand. And then Mothra's wings began, slowly, to unfold once more. She rose from the tidal flats with a deliberate gentleness that stirred barely a breath of wind across the gathered crowd, hovering just above the shoreline for one final moment, gaze sweeping once more across the assembled townspeople of Kelstadt, the poorest, most forgotten corner of a broken nation, who had offered her nothing but open doors and undefended wonder. And then she turned, banking north, back out over open water, back toward the horizon where the vague, distant shape of her original hatching island still lay wreathed in morning mist. "She's leaving," someone in the crowd said, disappointment plain in the word. "No," Armin said slowly, watching the trajectory of her flight with dawning, careful understanding. "She's not leaving. Look at the direction. That's not away from us." He turned to Hange, something like urgent clarity breaking across his face. "That's toward Marley." The realization reached Theo Magath's desk 4 hours later, relayed by fast signal from the naval reconnaissance vessel still shadowing the coastline at a cautious distance. Entity has changed course, bearing consistent with direct approach toward Marleyan mainland. Estimated arrival within 36 hours at current flight speed. Magath read the signal 3 times, set it down, and allowed himself, for one brief unguarded moment, the specific exhaustion of a man who had spent his entire career building contingencies for a world that kept refusing to hold still long enough to let any of them matter. "Convene the full war council," he told his aide. "Every Titan holder we have operational. Every warrior candidate passed initial training. I want Liberio's full defensive capability assessed and ready within 24 hours. He paused, then added, quieter, almost to himself. And someone find me everything we have on record about what mercy costs a nation that's never once been asked to earn it. Outside his window, Liberio's gray internment districts stretched on beneath a sky still clear of any winged shape. For now, while 300 miles west, across dark water already beginning to catch the first gray light of dawn, a goddess flew steadily onward, carrying toward the one nation in this broken world that had built its entire understanding of strength on cruelty, a judgment that would, before it was finished, force Marley to answer for every choice that had brought it to this reckoning. Liberio had never built defenses for something it could not name. For a century, Marley's military doctrine had rested on two unshakable premises: that the 9 Titans were the only power in the world capable of reshaping continents, and that Marley, having harnessed the largest share of them, held the whip hand over every nation too weak or too late to do the same. Every wall, every artillery emplacement, every doctrine drilled into the warrior candidates from childhood had been built to answer that specific, familiar shape of threat. None of it had ever accounted for something that arrived asking a moral question instead of making a territorial one. Theo Magath stood at the head of the War Council table in the pre-dawn dark, 36 hours after the signal that had set all of Liberio's military apparatus into motion, watching the assembled generals, Titan holders, and civilian ministers argue in circles that all led, eventually, to the same unanswerable place. "We have 4 operational Titans within immediate deployment range," said General Theodot Kelling, a hard-eyed veteran of the internment zone crackdowns, who had never once, in Magath's estimation, met a problem he didn't believe could be solved with sufficient force. The armored, the jaw, the cart, and the beast's successor still completing integration. Deploy all 4 in a coordinated engagement the moment the creature enters Marleyan airspace, before it has the chance to observe anything it might use against us. And if it responds the way it responded to the aberrant on that island, Reiner said, voice flat with the particular authority of someone who had actually stood in this creature's presence and watched what she was capable of when provoked, we lose 4 Titans and confirm to her, beyond any doubt, that Marley is exactly the kind of nation that answers an unknown visitor with immediate violence. General, I watched her burn a Titan's mouth to ruin with nothing but the dust off her own wings. She didn't have to try. So your recommendation is what exactly? Kelling snapped. That we simply let a creature capable of that kind of destruction fly directly into Liberio and hope she likes what she finds? My recommendation, Reiner said, is that we remember what happened to every nation in this war, that assumed strength alone would carry the day. Marley believed that for 80 years, right up until Aaron Yeager proved it wrong in an afternoon. I'm not eager to make the same mistake twice. Magath raised a hand before the argument could sharpen further, and the room, out of long habit and grudging respect, quieted. We will not deploy Titans as a first response, Magath said. Reiner is correct. If this creature is capable of the judgment the Paradisian reports describe, an immediate show of force confirms every worst assumption she might already be forming about this nation. But neither will we stand entirely undefended. He looked to Porco. Full readiness, positioned but not engaged, at every major population center. If she proves hostile, we respond. If she does not, he paused, choosing the next words with visible difficulty, a man forcing himself to speak a strategy he did not fully believe in yet. Then we attempt something Marley has not seriously attempted in living memory. We let her see us as we actually are, and we hope that's enough. Gabby, seated at the table's far end among the junior officers permitted to observe but not yet to speak, exchanged a glance with Falco that carried more history in it than either of them had words for. What does "as we actually are" even mean? she said quietly, after the room had moved on to logistics, low enough that only Falco could hear. Liberio's internment zones. The warrior program taking children out of their families to die for a country that treats them as expendable the moment they're grown. Is that what we let her see? Falco didn't answer immediately. When he did, his voice carried the same quiet weight it always did when he actually meant what he said, rather than what was expected of him. Maybe that's exactly what she needs to see, Gabi. If she's judging the whole world the way the Paradisian reports say, the graves, the wealth, the suffering, then maybe the only honest thing left to do is stop hiding the parts of Marley that don't look good, and let her decide with the truth instead of the version we'd rather show her. Gabi was quiet for a long moment, watching the War Council's frantic preparations continue around them. Generals arguing over artillery placement, aides running reports back and forth, the whole vast machinery of a nation bracing for a reckoning it did not yet know how to survive. I used to think the only thing that mattered was proving Marley was strong enough to never be hurt again, she said finally. I don't know if I believe that anymore. I watched what strength alone did to us during the rumbling. Maybe survival needs something else this time. Mothra reached Liberio's outer coastline at dusk on the second day, her vast silhouette visible against the setting sun for nearly 20 minutes before she came close enough for any ground observer to make out detail, and the entire city, soldiers and internment zone Eldians alike, a divide Marley had spent 80 years enforcing with brutal, absolute rigidity, stopped to watch her approach with an identical, uniting dread that neither side of that ancient divide had shared in living memory. She did not attack the artillery positions arrayed along the coastal defense line, though every gunner stood at their station with hands shaking on cold metal, waiting for an order that Magath, watching from the command tower with his jaw set tight, refused to give. She did not descend on the military district first, nor the shipyards, nor any of the visible instruments of Marleyan power that Kelling had insisted would be her obvious first target. She flew, instead, directly toward the internment zone. It sprawled along Liberio's eastern edge, walled off from the rest of the city by fences and checkpoints, and the particular grim architecture of a place designed to house a population the government had decided, generations ago, deserved neither comfort nor dignity. Cramped housing blocks, threadbare gardens, the visible poverty of a people who had spent nearly a century being told, in every possible way a nation could tell its own citizens, that they were lesser. Mothra descended over the zone's central square as the last light failed, wing beats slowing, golden dust drifting down over rooftops and narrow streets crowded with Eldian families who had spent their entire lives being taught to expect nothing but cruelty from anything more powerful than themselves, and who now stood in their doorways and courtyards, disbelieving, as a goddess lowered herself gently into the one part of Marley that had never once been shown mercy by anything wearing a uniform. She did not land fully. She hovered, close enough now that individual faces were visible to her ancient, faceted eyes, sweeping slowly across the crowded rooftops, the cramped alleys, the threadbare washing lines strung between buildings never meant to house this many people in this little space, and the low cello hum resonating from her body deepened into something heavier, sadder, than anything the Survey Corps scouts had documented since her emergence 6 days prior. An old woman stepped out into the square below her, an Eldian grandmother who had survived 3 purges and buried more family than she had ever spoken of aloud, and lifted both hands toward the hovering shape above her, not in defense, not in supplication, but in the simple, exhausted gesture of someone acknowledging, finally, after a lifetime of being told she did not matter, that something vast and ancient had chosen to look directly at her and see her suffering as real. "You see it too," the old woman said, voice carrying clear and steady across the silent square. "Good. Somebody should have, a long time ago." Mothra held there for a long, aching moment, And then, slowly, deliberately, she began to descend fully, folding her vast wings, settling her full weight for the first time onto Marleyan soil, directly in the heart of the internment zone's central square, close enough now that anyone brave enough to approach could reach out and touch the warm, faintly glowing scales along her flank. Word reached Magath's command tower within minutes. Entity has landed. Location: Internment Zone Central Square. No hostile action taken. Crowd gathering. No violence reported. Magath stood at the window, watching the distant golden glow of her settled form, lighting up the zone's crowded rooftops from below, and felt the full, dizzying weight of the choice now facing him. General Kelling wants a strike order ready within the hour, Porco reported, arriving breathless at his side. He says a target that's landed and stationary is the best chance we'll get. Magath was quiet for a long moment, watching the golden light below, thinking of the Eldian children who had been marched through those same cramped streets his entire career, thinking of everything Marley had built its strength upon, and everything that strength had cost the people currently gathered, unafraid, around the one being in this war who had finally chosen to see them. "Tell General Kelling," Magath said finally, "that if he gives that strike order without my direct authorization, I will have him relieved of command before the first shell leaves the barrel." He turned from the window, jaw set with the specific, hard-won clarity of a man finally choosing a side he should have chosen decades ago. "Get me Reiner. Get me Debby and Falco. If that creature is sitting in the one part of this city that spent 80 years being told it doesn't matter, then I want Marley's response delivered by the people who've actually understood, for years now, exactly how much that cruelty has cost us." Reiner reached the internment zone's central square just past midnight, Debby and Falco a half-step behind him, all three moving through checkpoint after checkpoint that had never in memory been ordered open this freely, for Eldian civilians pressing close to watch a miracle. The crowd had grown steadily since Mothra's landing, hundreds now, spilling out from every adjoining street, lit gold by the soft glow still pulsing faint along her folded wings, and the mood among them had shifted from disbelieving awe into something Reiner had never once witnessed in this part of the city: quiet, unguarded hope. He stopped at the square's edge, closer to her now than he had ever been, close enough to feel the low, resonant hum in his own chest, the way Hange had described it, and found himself, despite every hardened year of soldiering, unable to look away from the ancient, patient violet eyes that turned, slowly, to regard him. "She knows who I am," he said quietly, to Debby. "Or she knows what I carry at least. Does that scare you?" Debby asked. "No," Reiner said, and found, saying it, that it was true. "I think I want her to know. I think, for once, I want something in this world to actually see the whole truth of what I've done, instead of a version I've had to soften for someone's comfort." He stepped forward, alone, past the loose-gathered crowd, until he stood almost directly beneath her lowered head, and found he had no rehearsed words ready, only the truth, plain and unadorned, the way he had learned, slowly and at terrible cost, was the only kind of honesty that mattered anymore. "I've done things in your judgment's name that I'll never be able to make right," Reiner said, voice steady despite everything it cost him. "I carried a Titan into a city full of children, because I was told it was for my nation. I believed it, for a long time. I don't believe most of it anymore. I don't know what you're looking for here, or what you'll decide when you've seen enough, but if you're weighing whether this world deserves saving, I want you to weigh it with the truth, not the parts of Marley that look good from a distance. This." He gestured without turning, at the cramped square, the threadbare buildings, the crowd of Eldian civilians who had spent their whole lives fenced into a fraction of the dignity anyone else took for granted. "This is what my strength was built on. I don't think it's enough anymore, whatever you decide." Mothra held perfectly still, ancient eyes fixed on him with an intensity that felt, for one unbearable moment, like being fully known, in a way Reiner had spent his entire adult life avoiding. And then, slowly, her great head lowered further, until it hovered barely above the old grandmother who had first stepped forward hours before, and the low hum shifted, deepened, resonated through the whole gathered crowd at once like a held breath finally released. Gabby felt it in her own chest before she understood what she was feeling. A wave of something that was not quite grief and not quite forgiveness, but some third thing this world had no ready word for. And looking around the crowd, she saw the same expression breaking across dozens of faces at once. Soldiers and Eldian civilians alike, the ancient enforced divide between them dissolving, for one impossible shared moment, beneath the weight of being seen by something that judged neither side as less than fully human. "She's not choosing Marley or Paradis," Falco said quietly, watching with wide, unblinking eyes. "She's not choosing sides at all. I don't think that was ever the question." "Then what is the question?" Gabby asked. "Whether we're capable of choosing each other," Falco said, "once somebody makes us actually look." Yelena's report reached Paradis 3 days later, carried by a merchant vessel making the increasingly common crossing between the two nations that 4 years of tentative, fragile peace had only just begun to permit. A report describing, in careful, unembellished detail, everything witnessed in Liberio's internment zone, the landing, the vigil, Reiner's confession, the crowd's shared and unprecedented grief. Hange read it twice at their desk, then set it down and looked up at Levi, Armin, and the small cluster of Survey Corps leadership gathered for the briefing, with an expression caught somewhere between wonder and dawning, uneasy understanding. "She's not going to pick a side," Hange said slowly. "Everyone keeps asking whether she'll side with Paradis against Marley, or judge one nation worthy and the other not. That was never the shape of the question. She's testing whether either side is capable of seeing the other as something other than an enemy to be managed. That's a test most of this world's leadership is going to fail," Levi said flatly. "You've read the same history I have. 80 years of Marley telling its own people we're devils. A century of the old order inside these walls lying about everything past the gate. Nobody in power on either side has spent much time practicing the kind of honesty Reiner just gave her in that square." "Then maybe," Armin said quietly, "that's exactly the point. Maybe she's not here to save a world that's already good. Maybe she's here to see whether it's capable of becoming good, given the chance. And I don't think we get to know the answer to that without actually trying." Historia, present at the briefing in the quiet, unassuming way she preferred over the pomp her position technically afforded her, had been silent through most of the exchange, weighing something in her expression that finally settled into a decision. "Send an official delegation to Marley," she said. "Not military. Not another reconnaissance mission dressed up as diplomacy. An actual attempt at the kind of honesty Reiner Braun just offered her, on Paradis's part this time. If she's testing whether this world can choose each other over cruelty, then Paradis needs to be part of proving that answer, not simply watching Marley prove it alone." "That's an enormous risk," Niall Doc said, though with less of his earlier hard edge. 4 years of fragile peace, and you want to send an official delegation into the heart of the nation that spent 80 years calling us devils. 4 years of fragile peace, built on nobody actually being honest with each other, Historia said, is not peace at all. It's simply a war that's paused for breath. If we want something that actually lasts, we start now, while a god is watching to see if we mean it. The delegation that assembled over the following week was small, deliberately so. Hange, chosen for both diplomatic standing and the singular authority of having witnessed Mothra's arrival from its very first moment, and Armin, whose careful, patient study of the creature's behavior had made him, by unanimous agreement, the single person in Paradis best equipped to help translate whatever came next. They crossed to Marley aboard the same merchant vessel that had carried Yelena's report, escorted at a wary distance by Marleyan naval craft under Magath's direct order, and arrived in Liberio to find Mothra still resting in the internment zone's central square 9 days after her landing, the longest she had remained in any single location since her emergence from the sea. She had not moved. The crowd around her had settled into something resembling a permanent vigil, families bringing what modest food and comfort they could spare, an entire community organizing itself, unbidden, around the presence of something that had chosen, out of the whole broken world, to rest among the people history had most thoroughly failed. Magath met Hange and Armin at the square's edge personally, a gesture of respect that would have been unthinkable between their two nations even a year prior, and the three of them stood together, watching the ancient, patient shape breathing slow in the golden light of late afternoon. "She hasn't moved in 9 days, Magath said. "My generals want to know what that means." "I confess I no longer have a confident answer. I think," Armin said slowly, watching the crowd gathered close around her, the quiet, unguarded ease between soldiers and internment zone civilians that would have been impossible a month before. "She's waiting to see if this lasts, if the honesty in this square is a moment, or a beginning." "And if it's only a moment?" Magath asked. Nobody answered him, because none of them, in that quiet golden square, honestly knew. And far above them, though none noticed it yet, a new shape had begun to darken the eastern horizon, moving fast and low across open water, a shape none of the assembled watchers would recognize until it was far too close to stop. The shape resolved, within the hour, into a formation of 11 ironclad warships flying the joined banners of the Mideast Allied forces, the coalition of nations that had spent the better part of a century watching Marley and its rivals wage war over Titan supremacy from the sidelines, arming themselves in careful, patient secrecy against the day that supremacy might finally be broken, and the old order's spoils divided among whoever moved fastest. That day, in the collective judgment of the Allied Forces War Ministry, had apparently arrived. The intelligence reaching their command structure over the past 11 days had been fragmentary, filtered through half a dozen intermediaries, and colored by every rumor a frightened, uncertain world could generate. An unprecedented weapon, larger than any Titan, that had seemingly chosen to ally itself with Marley's most oppressed and, by extension, its most easily radicalized population. To a coalition that had spent generations calculating the balance of power in this world, down to the last artillery shell, the reports read as something far more dangerous than a miracle. They read as the birth of an uncontested new superweapon, and Marley's internment zone, full of a population the Allied forces' own intelligence had long assessed as ripe for exactly this kind of ideological capture, as its likely staging ground. "They think she's ours," Magath said, reading the intercepted diplomatic cable with a dawning, furious disbelief, standing at the command tower window as the 11 warships drew steadily closer to Liberio's harbor. "They think Marley engineered this, that we're preparing to unleash something worse than the rumbling on the rest of the world, and they intend to strike first before we can." "Do we have any actual defense against a coalition fleet that size?" Reiner asked, already calculating troop deployments out of old habit, even as every instinct told him this crisis had nothing to do with conventional strength. "Against the fleet, yes," Magath said. "Against the panic that sent it, no. And if a single shell from that formation lands anywhere near her..." He didn't finish the thought. He didn't need to. Hange, still present in the city as part of the Paradisian delegation, arrived at the command tower at a dead run, Armin close behind, both having watched the warship formations approach from the internment zone's rooftops with the same cold understanding gripping everyone in the tower. "You need to signal them," Hange said, breathless. Whatever channel Marley has open to the Allied forces, you need to use it now, before someone on either side does something that can't be undone. I've tried, Magath said grimly. Their ministry's response was that Marley has lied about the Titans for 80 years, and they see no reason to trust our word now, on a matter this large. They intend to assess the threat directly, which I suspect means they intend to fire on it the moment it's within range, and see what happens. Armin was already moving toward the tower's signal room, mind racing through every diplomatic channel, every scrap of protocol he'd ever studied for exactly this kind of impossible crisis. Then we don't ask them to trust Marley's word. We give them something they can verify with their own eyes. Get me a direct line to their flagship. Let me talk to whoever's actually making the call on that bridge. Aboard the Allied forces' flagship Sovereign's Watch, Admiral Kaveh Rashidi studied the approaching city through his spyglass with the flat, calculating patience of a man who had spent 30 years preparing for exactly this kind of unprecedented threat, and felt none of the uncertainty gripping the command tower he now had in his sights. Signal from Marley in command requesting direct communication, his signals officer reported. They claim the entity is neither a weapon nor under their control. Of course they claim that, Rashidi said. What would you expect them to claim, with our fleet bearing down on the one asset that could finally break their century-long monopoly on Titan supremacy? He lowered the spyglass, jaw set. Bring the forward battery to readiness. If this creature is what our intelligence suggests, I want the first strike delivered, before it has the chance to demonstrate whatever it's truly capable of. Sir, his signals officer said, hesitating in a way that made Rashidi turn. They're patching through a direct voice signal. Not from Marley in command. A Paradisian representative. Rashidi's eyebrows rose fractionally. Paradis. The island the rest of the world had spent generations calling the source of every Titan on Earth, now apparently caught in the middle of this crisis alongside its oldest enemy. That, at least, was new enough to warrant a moment's attention. Put it through. Armin's voice, steady despite the enormity of what he was attempting, crackled through the flagship's signal room. Admiral Rashidi, my name is Armin Arlert, representing the government of Paradis. I understand your fleet believes you're approaching a weapon built by Marley. I'm asking you, before you fire a single shell, to consider what kind of weapon grieves over the graves of its enemies' dead. What kind of weapon lands, of its own choosing, not among the powerful, but among the most powerless people in the nation you believe built it. I've studied this creature since the day she hatched. She is not a weapon. She is something this world has never had to categorize before. And if your fleet fires on her believing otherwise, I don't think either of our nations will survive finding out how wrong that assumption was. The signal room went quiet, the distant hum of the flagship's engines the only sound beneath Armin's fading words. A pretty speech, Rashidi said finally, from a nation whose entire history is built on Titans devouring anyone who trusted them at close range. Then don't trust my words, Armin said. Trust what your own instruments are already showing you. Check your readings on troop movement, on population behavior in that internment zone over the last 9 days. You'll find no mobilization, no fortification, no weapons buildup of any kind around her position. Only civilians, gathering closer to something they've decided, for the first time in their lives, might actually be safe to trust. Ask yourself what kind of weapon inspires that, instead of terror. Rashidi was silent for a long moment, weighing something behind his flat, calculating expression that even his own signals officer couldn't read. Then, slowly, he raised his spyglass again, studying the distant golden glow still visible above the internment zone's rooftops even at this range, and the crowd, visible now even from this distance, gathered close and unafraid around something vast enough to erase the entire fleet bearing down on it in a single unopposed strike, and choosing, instead, to simply sit among them in stillness. Hold forward battery, he said finally, lowering the glass. Full readiness, but hold fire. I want a landing party ashore within the hour, under flag of parley, and I want to see this creature with my own eyes before this fleet commits to anything it cannot undo. He turned to his signals officer, expression still hard, still wary, but no longer entirely closed. Signal Marley in command. Tell them the Allied forces are willing to observe before we judge. That is the only mercy I'm prepared to extend on rumor alone. The landing party that came ashore an hour later found the internment zone's central square exactly as Armin had described it. A crowd of ordinary, unarmed civilians gathered in quiet reverence around a creature of impossible scale, who lifted her ancient head at the newcomer's approach and regarded the uniformed Allied forces officers with the same patient, searching attention she had turned on every faction that had crossed her path since the day she hatched. Admiral Rashidi himself walked to the square's edge, flanked by 2 aides, and stood for a long moment in silence, studying the vast, radiant, unmoving shape before him, with an expression that shifted, slowly and visibly, from wary calculation into something considerably harder for a career military officer to name. She's not what the reports described, he said finally, quiet, mostly to himself. No, Magath said, arriving at his side with Reiner and Hange close behind. The 4 of them representing, in that single moment, 3 nations that had spent generations treating one another as existential threats, standing together now in uneasy, unprecedented alliance. She isn't, and I think, Admiral, we're all going to have to decide, together, what we intend to become in front of her, because I don't believe she's finished watching yet. Above them, Mothra held her position, wings still folded, ancient violet eyes moving slowly across the gathered representatives of 3 nations that had never once, in the whole of recorded history, stood peacefully in the same square together, and the low cello hum resonating from her body deepened, once more, into something that felt, to everyone gathered close enough to feel it in their own chest, unmistakably like the sound of a held breath, waiting to see what this fragile, unprecedented moment would become. The parley in the internment zone square stretched through the remainder of that day, and long into evening, 3 nations' representatives sitting in a loose circle at the edge of Mothra's chosen resting place, working through the kind of plain, unguarded honesty that 4 years of fragile peace between Marley and Paradis had never quite managed, and that Marley and the Allied forces had never even attempted. Admiral Rashidi spoke first of the century his own coalition had spent arming itself in the shadows, waiting for Titan supremacy to crack, so they could seize what was left, an admission that cost him visibly, delivered anyway because a god was watching and he had, somewhere in that long afternoon, decided he would rather be seen honestly than judged for a lie. Magath spoke of the internment zones, of children conscripted into the warrior program before they were old enough to understand what they were being asked to die for, of 80 years of engineered hatred that had cost both nations more than either had ever fully reckoned with. Hange spoke of the century behind the walls, the lies fed to entire generations to keep them docile and afraid. Reiner said little, but what he said looking directly up at the vast, patient shape above them, and it was enough. Mothra listened to all of it, or seemed to, in whatever way her ancient, unknowable mind processed the small, halting confessions of exhausted, frightened nations finally choosing truth over posture, and said nothing, because she had never needed words. She had only ever needed to watch, and wait, and see whether the choosing was real. It was near midnight when she finally moved. She rose from the square slowly, wings unfolding in that same deliberate, unhurried grace that had marked every motion since her emergence from the sea, and the assembled representatives of 3 nations that had, for one impossible day, chosen honesty over cruelty, watched in silence, as she climbed into the star-scattered dark above Liberio. She circled once, twice, gathering the golden dust of her passage into a slow spiral that caught the moonlight and turned the whole night sky above the internment zone briefly, achingly beautiful. And then she began to climb higher and higher, back out over open water, back toward the small black island where she had first broken free of the sea. "She's leaving," Debby said, watching from the square's edge, some complicated mixture of relief and loss in her voice that mirrored exactly what everyone else standing there felt. "She got her answer," Armin said quietly, beside her. "Not a perfect one, not a finished one, just a beginning." 3 nations sitting in the same square, telling each other the truth for the first time in longer than any of us can remember. "I don't think she came here to fix this world for us. I think she came to see if we were still capable of trying, and I think, today, we proved that we are." Mothra's silhouette shrank against the moonlit sky, wings catching starlight in slow, patient arcs, until she was only a distant golden glimmer over open water, and then, gradually, gone, leaving behind a fragile, unfinished, and entirely unprecedented alliance between 3 exhausted nations who had, for one single day, chosen to be honest with each other, because something ancient and watching had asked nothing more of them than that. She did not return. In the weeks that followed, fishing crews along the southern coast would occasionally report a distant golden light far out at sea at dusk, keeping some private, ancient vigil over a world she had judged, not perfect, not healed, but finally, fragilely, willing to try. And the small black island where she had first hatched sat empty and quiet beneath the waves' endless turning, waiting, perhaps, for the day the world proved it had kept the promise it made in that square. Reiner Braun went home to Liberio that night, and, for the first time since he could remember, slept without dreaming of the things he'd done. Debby and Falco walked the internment zone streets in the gray dawn light, past soldiers and Eldian civilians speaking to one another without the old, practiced cruelty, and understood, in the quiet way certain understandings arrive, that whatever Marley became from here would be built, at least in part, on what they had chosen to be honest about in front of a god who never once raised her voice to demand it. Hange returned to Paradis to tell Historia that the world had not been saved, not in any final or permanent sense, only offered, by something ancient and patient and merciful beyond any measure this broken world had earned, a single chance to become something worth saving. And across 3 nations that had spent generations calling each other monsters, a fragile, unfinished peace began, haltingly, to take root, not because a goddess had judged them worthy, but because she had simply waited long enough, and watched closely enough, for them to choose it themselves.